So again, I'd just like to welcome everyone here. I suppose when I thought about launching the report and doing this event, and when I spoke to my colleagues who were speaking today, we thought about a fairly maybe intimate gathering or a small seminar type orientation, and then we end up with about 200 delegates registered yesterday. So it is great to see such interest in the area. And I suppose it goes back a couple of years to when we got the funding from the Irish Research Council for the Humanities and Social Sciences to undertake this piece of work. And I didn't foresee at the time that would be, by the time we'd have all the data and be where we are today, that it would be so relevant and I suppose so current. And even that in the last month or so, we have now a new department and minister appointed to the whole area of public expenditure and reform. So I suppose it's very timely from that perspective. And I just want to acknowledge my two co-authors. Geraldine Brady worked as a research assistant on the project and was beating down the doors to get the data, and Julian Dooley from Limerick. And also, I think what's interesting about this, my presentation in particular, is that this is the senior civil service manager speaking about leadership from their own perspective. And I'd like to acknowledge their participation very much at the outset. We wouldn't be here today without that. So we did meet with all the Secretaries General at the start of the project in each of the departments who participated, and I'll go through all that detail in a while. And they all saw the value of participating, so I'd like to, I appreciate that very, very much in terms of getting access. 146 managers who went through this process of being evaluated by themselves but by others, and everybody who participated in it and allowed us to gather the data that we have. So I think that's important to acknowledge those individuals. This slide here, I won't go into in detail, and Brian has referred to it, sort of just captures some of the initiatives and past developments and policies in the whole area of public service modernisation. And it is something that has been around for a long time, the need for reform, how we're going to achieve it, etc. And if we look, going back to the Strategic Management Initiative 1994, delivering better government, through to the OECD, that external perspective in 2008, right up to, I suppose, what's informing the agenda at the moment. And Philip Kelly will speak in the afternoon about this, who's overseeing the Transforming Public Services programme within the Department of Finance, which I assume will change into Minister Howland's department in due course. The focus comes back, or within these, a lot to the human resource side, the leadership questions, and the role that leadership and effective management plays in delivering reform. And I suppose from what we know about change, it's the easy part is the strategizing and deciding what the plans are and where we should be. And the real challenge for public or private sector organisations, a lot of the time it's not just a public service or public sector issue, mind you, is actually enacting and delivering that change. So that's, I suppose, the background there does very much call for effective leadership to drive the change, and it will be the incumbent managers and the forthcoming senior managers who will be able to deliver this change. And that's why we were interested in the question that really is at the heart of our particular study and at the heart of our particular piece of research. The new public management agenda and public sector reform rely heavily on effective leadership, and there's lots of research there that points to that. And as I say, that's I think we all kind of acknowledge that at this stage. And I don't need to go to sell the fact that leadership is critical in organisations in terms of achieving the organisational objectives, whether they are public sector, private sector, or even the voluntary sector. And as we there's a lot of literature review and work that we did before we went out to gathering the data in this particular project, which I'm not going to focus on today. I'm going to focus more on what does the data say. And Brian referred briefly to this. One of the limitations, if you like, with some of the thinking on leadership and our understanding of leadership theory and thought to date is that a lot of the focus historically has been on the concept of effective personal or personality leadership traits. And yes, they're important, but effective leadership is about many more things than whether you're charismatic, etc., the kind of things that we talk about a lot. So in the current project, that pointed us, after doing a good bit of review of the various instruments that are available and various ways of assessing leadership, to an instrument that has been recently developed by Dave Ulrich in the States, called the Leadership Code. And this is the theory, if you like, or the instrument that we use to gather the data that we'll be looking at in this study. So I just want to kind of briefly explain it so that you'll understand where we're coming from with it. And this leadership code is a way of thinking about effective leadership. And it looks at two different dimensions and calls for different skill sets, if you like, across these two different dimensions. And the first is the orientation around time, and whether as leaders and effective managers, as a consequence, the focus is on more short-term thinking or more long-term strategic perspectives. And the second area here is on the focus of attention, whether leaders look at the individuals within an organisation or more focused on the overall organisation itself. So coming out of that, there's kind of 5 domains that make up, or 5 areas that make up effective leadership, as Ulrich would argue. And the first is the strategists. So effective leaders are very good strategists in terms of shaping the future, determining what it is that the organisation or their unit needs to achieve. And that perspective is more long-term and focused and at the organisational level. In terms of the organisational focus, more maybe short-term, and yet is important, is the focus on being an executor and making things happen and achieving results and getting things done. President saying it's an unfortunate term. Depends on who you're trying to execute, I suppose. So that they're kind of areas that are required of effective leadership on the right-hand side of the organisational level. If we move to looking at people and capability and competencies in any organisation, when I get up and speak to people, I'd argue, I suppose my area is human resource management. If you take out the people out of an organisation, you would expect that organisation to fail and replace them with an entirely new set of staff, because those human capital skill sets are critical. So this is looking at the people side. And the longer term perspective is developing the next generation talent, being focused on succession planning, gearing up your staff to have the skills, knowledge and abilities to be able to perform effectively, not necessarily today, but for the challenges ahead. And a lot of organisations, not solely down to public sector context either, don't necessarily do these things very effectively, because they're more concerned with the short term or the nearer term. And that's looking at things like what they call talent manager, engaging the existing talent, and of course that's important. So what this theory says is that by looking at effective leadership really is all those things. So it's not easy, and that's for sure and certain, but it is very important, and it's underpinned by this concept of personal proficiency. And that there in the middle is really a lot of the focus of the literature on leadership, if one was to start reading it, looking at what it is that makes people effective in terms of personality traits, etc. And that's critical. Both these other elements are critical as well. So what do some of these things actually mean? Personal proficiency includes competencies such as clear thinking, being able to tolerate stress, being resilient, having a high degree of learning agility, achieving personal results. The strategist is about creating the strategic vision, being customer-centric. Executor is about getting things done, the person who achieves results. Human capital developer is all about the future skills, talents, as I said. And talent manager is how effectively managers engage with their staff, the current staff that they have. So effective leadership is about doing all of those things in an effective way. So that's just underpins, I suppose, to explain what instrument we used and what underpinned our assessment of leadership capability among senior managers in the Irish civil service. So, as has been mentioned earlier this morning, The data, we started to gather the data around April of 2010, and we customised and reviewed. It was an online instrument, and I'll explain that in a minute. So there were 13 departments in the Office of the Revenue Commissioners who participated, which is, something like 81% of the various departments. So there was a high uptake. And we met with the Secretaries General in all the departments to explain the project and I suppose for them to understand what was involved. And it was a kind of an onerous process because there was a lot of surveys to be completed, as you'll see. There were 6 to 16 Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General and Principal Officers who participated depending on the size of the department. So bigger departments would have had more participating so that we get more of a reflective sample. So it was the top 3 grades of the civil service management: Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General and Principal Officer. And in total 146 managers participated, so 8 Secretary Generals, 37 Assistant Secretaries and 101 Principal Officers. And the methodology was a 360-degree review process, so just, I suppose, so that we understand what's involved in that, it includes the self-assessment. So you would complete, if I was one of the Assistant Secretary Generals participating, I would complete a questionnaire assessing all those areas of effective leadership that I put up earlier on. My manager completed that as well online, privately. And then maybe at least 3 direct reports, so people within my team. So if I'm Assistant Secretary General, would be my principal officers, would have completed the same assessment, talking about my leadership capability. And then some of my peers at Assistant Secretary General level completed it about me as well. So historically, or I suppose traditionally, we tend to see we should be getting feedback from our manager, so it moves on assessment to include those extra sources. So in total, there were 1,200 questionnaires completed and split out in this way. 146 self-assessments by those senior managers that I mentioned, 134 manager assessments, so 12 managers didn't complete, but then some Secretary Generals, the 8 Secretary Generals, obviously we didn't ask the ministers to complete those. What do the ministers know? I can say that down here. And then 403 peer assessments at the same level, so principal officers completing it about their principal officer peers, or assistant secretaries about their peers, and some Secretary Generals about their peers as well. So that's the data in terms of where the data comes from, and then 517 direct reports, which would have included, at this point, assistant principal officers for the principal officer grade. So I'd say at the end, the departments were delighted with us, with all the work that's transpired. But what it does show is that it's a very comprehensive assessment, and it's the data, the findings we'll draw from it are the findings from what these managers are saying about themselves. I think it's very interesting from that perspective. The rating scale, asked respondents to rate the various dimensions of effective leadership across a 5-point scale. So we tend to see these a lot in these kind of assessments. 1 being poor level of competence in this area, 2 fair, 3 good, 4 very good, and 5 is that someone is outstanding. The online questionnaire itself had 9 demographic and human capital questions, so the usual age, gender, how long they were working there. 72 questions assessing the 27 competencies that fell into those 5 domains that I mentioned earlier on. And one thing that we did was to customise and include some qualitative comments that took to the next level rather than just having numbers, and this proved very interesting when we started looking at the data. We asked each rater to specify the senior manager's top 3 strengths and development needs, but most importantly, and what has been very insightful, is the last one here, in terms of looking at public sector or civil service context factors affecting leadership capability. And that has thrown up a lot of interesting information about some of the constraints and all the issues that Brian would have raised there, and brings it very much to focus in terms of the civil service public sector context, which is different. And the political influence we all see is one of those dimensions that has come out of that. So that's just the background on the study itself and the data. So this slide here just indicates the numbers of managers across the different departments that participated. The Office of the Revenue Commissioners there were more participants there. They were interested in putting more people through the process. They were very interested in it, so they asked for more to participate. So that was fine. So on average, there was about maybe 12 to 13 senior managers who participated. 71% of the 146 managers were male and 29% female. And the majority were aged between 50 and 60, which you'd expect, I suppose, it to be an older age profile, and that you're talking about senior management levels. In terms of the public service or public sector tenure, how long they were there, 80% were working for 20 or more years in public service. And in terms of their current role, their job tenure, 4 to 10 years on average in the position that they were in currently. So quite a bit of experience, most of them really probably in public service for their working career. Okay, so what does the data tell us about leadership capability? So this brings us back to the 5 domains that I mentioned earlier, the 5 areas of effective leadership. And the highest scoring area, 3.85 out of 5, when we looked at all the assessments and ratings on average, is around the areas of personal proficiency. So the self-knowledge, the understanding of their own skills, abilities, etc. That was the highest rated domain. And the lowest rated domain, when we looked at self-ratings, peer, manager assessments, direct report assessments, was the whole area of human capital development. And this comes out as really some of these areas as key development needs for the sector. And I'll talk about that in more detail in the next few slides. So what were the top 5 strengths overall when we looked at the assessments and the rankings and the ratings, looking at the different scores? And these are the competency levels that fit into the 5 domains. Demonstrating learning agility, so that's how good we are, I suppose, at seeking new information and different sources of information was the top. Balancing work and non-work demands and delegation was the second highest rated strength. Tolerating stress and resilience, third. Self-knowledge, which is awareness of own strengths and development needs, is fourth. And delivering results at a personal level, in terms of the personal proficiency, is the fifth. So they're the top 5 strengths for the 146 managers. The top 5 development needs, so these would have been the lowest rated items or areas of effective leadership when we looked at all the scores. The top one was mapping the workforce. So we see 3 of these fall into the human capital developer domain, and that's really the focus on, if you remember the slide from the slide back, on the individual knowledge, skills and abilities of staff, and on the longer term perspective rather than the nearer term perspective. Aligning organisational and employee expectations, so that's, I suppose, getting employees to understand what it is expected of them in terms of their roles and what they do in their public sector jobs. Helping people manage their career, effective communication in terms of what's going on in the organisation, and then practicing clear thinking is about making, I suppose, effective decision making, things like that. The reports that you have a CD copy of in your packs goes into this in much more detail. I just want to give a flavour today of some of the top things, and if you have any questions you can ask me in more detail at the end. One interesting piece of assessment here was looking at the congruence across the different rating sources. So what we're looking at here is how close were the scores when you started to look at the different sources who were providing the ratings. So the first one here is the self-rating, so what people said about themselves around their strategist competencies. The next one here, this navy one, is their manager's assessment. The green one is what their peers said, and the direct reports is what their staff said. And when we look at it, we see across the board that the manager's assessments of competence are statistically significantly higher across all domains than are their own, but than are their direct reports and peers. And I suppose if I go back to my own PhD, which I did 10 years ago, or more now, I can't even recall at this stage, I did it in this area, and the same kind of thing came up in a big private sector bank where I did the study, that the closest raters were actually, closest assessments were peers and direct reports. And in that study at that time, I asked managers who'd gone through a 360, who was the best person to assess your performance in the workplace? And it stood out a mile that it was actually direct reports and not managers. There was a feeling the managers were too far removed maybe from the day-to-day and understanding of what was going on. So here we see that perhaps there's something to think about in terms of managers seem to have more inflated perspectives of effective leadership than do direct reports. That's definitely one for a high stool in Key Street rather than here. So to take it to the next level in terms of the leading in the public and civil service context, we included that question on all of the questionnaires was, what is it that's germane to the public sector that creates challenges or issues for effective leadership? Because I think it would be remiss of us not to have taken on board that it is different. The public sector is different than private sector organisations. So we use content analysis of over 600 comments that were given to us from various raters about these particular issues. And these included peer-to-peer comments about constraints at the same grade. So what I think is actually interesting here is it's not me saying, or someone external, even though I'm a public sector worker obviously, these are what people are saying about their issues, about their own grades, about their own context, and about their own organisations. Comments by direct reports and comments by managers. And there's 7 key themes, and again the report goes through these in great detail. So these are the key themes to come out as sort of public sector, civil service specific issues. And the first is this balance between risk-taking and leadership and the extent to which one can or cannot engage in that. So there was a sense among these participants and the raters that the balance between risk-taking, maintaining the status quo, really didn't, or was counteracted, if you like, the ability to be innovative and creative, so that it's a bit of a risk-averse environment. We kind of probably know that anyway. So what I do here is I'm pulling up some of the indicative comments. So there'll be a lot of comments that are largely saying the same thing, but I just want to pull out some of the ones that kind of nicely capture what it is I'm saying in this particular theme, and I do this for the next few slides. So this is an assistant principal officer talking about this particular issue. He or she states, "It is important to safeguard the integrity of public sector organisations by ensuring suitable processes, but the public service process may sometimes get more emphasis in terms of risk mitigation than outcomes." Okay, so a process rather than what's actually achieved. Not the most effective way, I suppose, for anyone to be behaving in terms of the work, getting work done. Another principal officer comment here, "The public service tends to have more emphasis on risk mitigation than outcomes, and thus a lack of scope for innovative thinking prevails." And the third comment is from an Assistant Secretary General. "Public sector organisations operate in a highly risk-averse environment, dictated by demands of public accountability and the media focus." And there was a lot of comments about the press at the moment and the bashing of the public sector. People felt sort of somewhat aggrieved by that, understandably so, I suppose. "This permeates organisational culture and impedes capacity to offer freedoms and latitude to individuals to pursue new approaches and adopt responsive service innovations." So really, that was one of the key themes to come out as a constraining factor within the public service context that adversely impacts upon effective leadership. So the ability to actually do different things, new things, be creative, driven, focus maybe a bit more on the process rather than the outcomes. The second theme to emerge strongly from the commentary was around The rigidity of organisation, structure and process. The structure of the public sector, its bureaucratic form, seen as a significant sector-specific factor, adversely impacting leadership effectiveness. And some of the comments here, again from an Assistant Secretary General. The structures and restrictions of government, as distinct from the private sector, oftentimes limits options, time taken to change, and require outmoded channels to be maintained and result in the inability to readily invest profits, aka savings, extra exchequer returns, in new or experimental ventures. There was a good bit of reference to the perceived rigidities of the industrial relations structure, which hinder flexibility. And I suppose some of the things we've heard of recently maybe might point to that a little bit. There was a lot of discussion as well about the inability to use the carrot and stick effectively when it comes to performance management. So there are very few instruments available to really motivate people. And I suppose if we look at the current context in the public sector, you know, things like promotion and all that now are stalled. So there's very few things to motivate or incentivize performance. But on the other hand, there's a perception that there's very few instruments to actually act as a stick to address underperformance as well. The tools available to manage to motivate staff are limited. There are very limited sanctions available, and the capacity to reward is severely constrained. Okay, so that's to do with the rigidity of organisation, structure and process. The next one was raised, and one of our audience members raised this, is the tension or the relationship with the political system and with ministers, etc. And this was seen to be constraining to leadership effectiveness and the achievement of results. So some of the comments that reflect this. The interaction from a principal officer, the interaction with the political system is of relevance and is a factor which does of course influence effective leadership. The political environment in which the public servant operates can dilute the impact of leadership. Initiatives which might have been led very strongly could be removed from the political agenda if there's a change of government or minister or policy. So a bit of tension between what they can be doing as leaders and then the influence from the political system. And an Assistant Secretary General made this remark, and I think it's an interesting one, and again captures a lot of sentiment in this area. Our public service needs to become more business-like to deliver public goals more quickly. The highest levels of our public service need to rediscover the capacity to influence government policy through their ministers. It is not enough merely to give the minister what he or she, but there might be a she minister, wants. Who fashions and pursues long-term national goals? No one. And I suppose this is one of the things that came out of the Rob Wright report on the Department of Finance's, the need for senior civil servants to very much stand their ground on issues and be very assertive if it's not necessarily what a minister wants to hear but needs to hear. That was the third contextual factor within the public sector. The fourth is the culture. The culture of the organisation. And every organisation has a culture, whether it's in the public or private sector. And that there's a sense that new leadership needs to be driven by top management. So unless the public service employees support from top management, it's very hard for the next level of management to change. Okay, you can read through that yourselves. Effective leaders in the public sector in the future will be ones who operate from a platform of openness, accountability, empowerment and considered self-interest, to work solely from a position of leading by example. So again, there is an acknowledgement there that some of these things might need to change for the better. The fifth area is recruitment, selection and promotion constraints. And this one again was quite prevalent when we looked at the comments. And there's a view that managers are restricted to effectively select and manage and develop their staff. And I suppose this goes back to the President's commentary at the outset a little bit as well, in terms of the centralisation maybe of control. An Assistant Secretary General, there needs to be more delegation of human resource practices, responsibilities and recruitment from centralised personnel units to regional management teams, so where people on the ground have a bit more say over processes of recruiting and appointing staff. That comment is calling for a more appropriate system of selection and to really start looking for leaders of tomorrow. And these slides will be available afterwards. I don't want to overburden you with some of the comments. Many public sector employees have experience or qualifications that are either not utilised or are underutilised. Leaders need to be able to identify these people and place them in positions where their talents may be used for the benefit of the organisation. So again, some of the appointments in the public sector would come from generic panels, and people are appointed based on where they are in panels rather than looking at their specialist expertise, so that's referring to that. An Assistant Secretary General here, within the civil service, one is allocated resources, and there's often little scope to have all the staff skills required assigned to a division, as the better people are generally recognised when the organisation is highly sought and competed for. Well, that's the same in every organisation, isn't it? Okay, so this second last kind of key public sector civil service context factor affecting leadership is resource to cope with demands, and this really is very much around the challenge of the current cutbacks that are there, employment control frameworks, resource constraints within which these senior managers are operating. Currently, leaders in the civil service in particular are having to do more and more with less. It will stretch people's time and energy. The sudden decapitation of leadership through the incentivised retirement scheme and threats to our pensions has led to increased workload for all, and many staff having to learn new areas without the hitherto reasonably smooth transfer of work and corporate knowledge. So, retaining knowledge within the organisation, etc., is a concern, and that is a concern where there are high levels of the high numbers of people taking early retirement and losing that knowledge and skill. And the moratorium on recruitment and promotions is affecting development of future leaders, as talented people will leave and the necessary new blood is not entering the public sector. The last kind of key theme to emerge from all those comments is around the lack of systems to enforce accountability. And again, this is about senior managers talking about their own challenges in leadership. So perceived lack of systems to enforce accountability, especially around staff performance. So what are some of the comments here that are indicative of this? Civil service culture whereby the requirement to deliver by managers is not paramount or obligatory. Real accountability is still not evident in most government departments. There is currently a lack of effective processes to allow managers to apply appropriate sanctions where staff fail to meet performance targets. Okay, so that takes us through, sorry, that was the last comment here. That takes us through the kind of key, very headline findings from the study that we did, and looking at some of the challenges and issues in the sector. So what? So what does all this say to us about effective leadership among senior civil service managers? I suppose change and the ability to deliver reform does lie largely with incumbent senior managers and those who are coming up through the system that's there. So it's their leadership capability that's critical, and that's why I think this question is vital, and that's why we're putting on this conference today, and why I think people understand this is very important. The highest rated leadership dimension was around personal efficiency, so those particular areas that are up there, commitment, stress management, etc. And the lowest area was around the long-term staffing perspective, and I think this one is very important going forward in terms of having an agenda to understand how it is that we can gear people up for the challenges that lie ahead, the human resource development and training agenda, etc., that Brian would have talked about earlier on. For many of the appointments from executive officer level up to principal officer level in the civil service, there is somewhat of an inflexibility in terms of matching competence to requirements, because they're based on generalist skills rather than special skills, and that is something that I'm going to talk a little bit about in a second. That's quite important to understand. But I think what's very good to see in the report and analysis is that, considering all the constraints that are there from these 1,200 assessments and comments and inputs from senior managers in the civil service, there really is a very clear acknowledgement and understanding of the need for change. And I think that was what I find really interesting doing the analysis, is it isn't someone coming from the outside saying this needs to be done. And I think that's the first really important step, or important sort of process for helping us to move along the reform agenda, is that there is an acknowledgement by senior managers that this needs to change. The need for a more effective performance management system is definitely one of the key things to come out of the study. And that use of charismatic terminology is used an awful lot in the commentary to motivate, maintain and address performance. And I suppose that's one of the things that hasn't developed hugely. There is a performance management and development system, but I think that could even be integrated more with human resource, other HR practices. The authority and adequate control mechanisms to effect real change, they're perceived to be absent really at the moment. And these are things that can be done, I think, and probably will be done, will have to be done. A sense that risk-taking, creativity and innovation are stifled and discouraged. So I think that is something as well that Brian mentioned there. Whether that's something that people were kind of self-limiting there, I don't know, or whether it is the reality. But sometimes that is a big question that will need to be teased out. Whether that's a self-limiting issue or whether it's the system. And if it's the system, that needs to change. Human capital development seen as critical. So looking at the skills that are needed going forward among middle-level management now coming up through the system. They are the next generation of senior leaders. So building that next generation talent is critical. Moving to a more longer-term perspective and understanding skill development. And a greater focus on specialist skills rather than generalist skills. And again, that came out of the Department of Finance review as well. So again, these are human capital issues that need to be thought about and certainly coming out of the report. And the need for senior management leadership development, and there's a very successful programme that Brian alluded to there in the IPA called the Leadership Challenge. It's aimed at assistant secretary and secretaries general level. And I think a lot more of that needs to be done in terms of gearing people up for effective leadership through education, experience, mentoring, etc. And these skills can be developed and enhanced. It's about enabling people to actually achieve that. This comment here from an Assistant Secretary General kind of sums up, if you like, in a very coherent way. And if I put this up at the start, you wouldn't have had to listen to me for the last 45 minutes. What it is that the study kind of reveals. Better systems for identifying and nurturing talent, focusing on the top management cadre, are required. More structured career planning and mobility through a senior public service is essential in making progress here generally. So that really concludes my presentation on the report. So you have a copy of that report on CD in your packs, and there will be a hard copy available at the desk after if you want to take that in addition. So I might open it up for questions.